Welcome to another episode of You Should Read This with my co-host here, Tom van der Lubbe, and me, Richard Atherton. On this episode, we're going to speak about this book, Antifragile, Things That Gain from... Tom's got the Dutch version now. Things That Gain from Disorder by none other than Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who was, of course, the author also of The Phenomenon, The Black Swan. This book's it's been around a long time now. In fact, that's one thing I noticed when I pulled this off the bookshelf. 2012, it was copyrighted, and I think I bought my copy of this pretty much soon after that. So, yeah, Tom, should we dive in? I know you've done some more studious note taking from the book itself. I wonder if we should sort of lay out the main flow of the book before we dive in.
I would just say, I mean, I bought it a couple of weeks ago. I actually was familiar with the idea of antifragile. We'll come to that in a few minutes. So for me, it was new. The book. I like Taleb a lot. So I would just say it's a very thick book. So it's 500 pages. It's very small. There's a lot of text on one page. So I'm totally fine with just picking out. I wouldn't say randomly, but just picking out a few things, because it's not possible to dive into all those different aspects because Taleb is all over the place. I would just say let just zoom in on the topics you like most, and then we'll probably also speak about Switzerland. We'll just see where we end up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with the main idea, right? And the main idea is that fragile things break under pressure. We think of glass, we think of China. They break under perturbation, under volatility. If they get shaken around too much, they break. And anti-fragile things actually grow. They benefit from volatility. They benefit from stress. They get stronger. And one of the things he points out is that he had to create this term, anti-fragile, because there is no term in, as far as he could work out, any of the main languages that has this idea. So it's actually the title of the book is actually a new word. The closest we've got to that idea in literature is in Greek mythology and the idea of Hydra, the multi-headed monster, and you cut off a head and more heads grow back. And so he cites that as an example of at least the idea in literature, if not the word. So yeah, that's the basic definition. Anything else to say on
I would
on the word?
The example, because it's, let's say, from a theoretical concept, is perhaps you understand it, but I still find it difficult to understand, to be honest. So what I like, and there's also a picture in the book. The picture he uses is bones. So and that's something which is probably more practical than Hydra with the heads. Because then you can say, yeah, that's something in mythology, etc. But bones, if you put pressure on bones, they become stronger. And the example he uses is African women or other women, doesn't matter where in the world, they can carry a lot of weight on their heads, and they have much stronger bones than if we would carry this stuff. And I think that's a very good example, which is perhaps a little bit more practical.
Yeah, and the other, I think I've seen him write out in other places about the related idea of post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
And we see that often in people's childhoods, right? I mean, obviously, this is a topic close to my heart, but the idea that we can have trauma and that can cause diminished outcomes in our life, but it can also lead to growth. And how many kids do we hear of, or that come from very difficult backgrounds and then go on to become, very successful businessmen or artists or whatever it might be? The idea being there that actually being exposed to a great deal of stress in some cases actually causes growth.
Yeah, there are a lot of examples. So there is, for instance, a lot of successful entrepreneurs are dyslexic, So let's say from a statistical point of view, there are too many, but it's because they're just solving ways around it. Or next week I do a book podcast in Dutch about Viktor Frankl, which is, let's say, all those people who survived concentration camps. You also have them often as an example, but there you also have a lot of people who let's say don't survive it, and by bones, for everybody it's more or less the same. So you need, if you put pressure on bones, everybody's bones get stronger, but not everybody survives, like Viktor Frankl, concentration camps, and then writes a brilliant book about it. So I still like this bones example very much.
Yeah. And then the other thing, well, when he goes on to talk about systems and anti-fragile systems, and the point that they're made up of fragile entities. And one of the examples he uses as an anti-fragile system is economies. So he says that generally man-made systems are fragile. If we think of toasters and kettles and computers, they're fragile. We all know it, right? They tend to break under stress. But economies, arguably a man-made construction, actually benefit from volatility. And every time in history when we've had governments try to overly constrain economies in order to reduce volatility, we have a negative outcome. So our economies are comprised of fragile firms, and right. So the firm as an entity, as an individually, can break, but overall, as long as we allow that economy to be exposed to sufficient volatility and stress, we'll see anti-fragile attributes of that system, and we'll see growth under stress and under volatility in the long run.
Yeah, what I like about the book is that, as you just said, is this whole idea of anti-fragility. He puts it doesn't matter in any subject. So in my book on 23, he has a kind of Excel sheet, and it goes all over the place. So it's about science, it's about business, it's about ways of thinking. It's even the way you behave as a tourist. And he talks about the idea of a flaneur who just starts walking somewhere and just decide, taking a decision at that moment where to go next, instead of saying, this is Monday, this should be Paris, and Tuesday I should be in Rome, or something like that. But what I also like is, for instance, if you talk about regulation, or if you talk about the podcast we also did in the past, is for him, virtues are anti-fragile and rules are fragile. So it is a very broad book, and it doesn't matter what part of life he takes, if it's political systems or foreign policy or thinking or medicine, food, restaurants, doesn't matter what it is. He just takes the whole world, so to say.
Yeah, and the other example I love is scientific progress, and how there's this myth in history that when he talks about the Industrial Revolution, that we had these great scientists who came up with these theories in this very linear, formal way. They moved on to create these inventions of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, his argument, of course, is no. This all happened through the tinkerings of amateurs who happened upon discoveries, and it was that out of that chaos emerged these great inventions which drove the Industrial Revolution, and in fact drive all change as he sees it, or at least all change in that manner. All the great innovations come from that. Yeah.
So what topics do you want to take out where you say, okay, there are just certain ideas and we can't just cover it all? What do you like most?
Well, I mean, one thing that I think it would have a lot of practical application, and certainly this is the thing I've taken most out in terms of my life of this book, in terms of value I've sort of imbibed in my own life, is this idea of the barbell strategy, right? So this is the idea that, so how do we set ourselves up as individuals to benefit from anti-fragility? And so he talks about, well, you want to set your life up such that you have certain assets secured so that you have a certain level of resilience in terms of, volatility out there, but that you're in a position to gain from high volatility. So in terms of an investment strategy, let's say, you'd want to have a high proportion of all of your investments in very low risk, and then a small proportion of your investments in very high risk, such that you're in a position to gain from high volatility, potentially from those high risk, but you've got enough of a secure income from your secure assets to keep going. And a poor strategy in that context would be to put all of your money on medium risk, because the other point that he makes in the book is that the larger the system, the more likely it is to experience a crisis. So if you've got an economy, a very large economy, and you're putting a lot of your investments, right down the middle on medium risk, and the whole economy falls over, you've lost everything.
Yep.
And so that's this idea of the barbell strategy I liked, and he applies it even to weight training, which I love. Right, like do a certain amount of exercise to keep yourself fit, but then when you hit the workout, go for the max weights and really stress the system.
Yeah, but he applies his barbell strategy on nearly any topic. Huh?
Yeah. What other ones do you like, or that come to mind for you?
That's what I just said in general. That he, what I find interesting is that he is not strictly focused on, let's say, only business.
Yeah.
But let's say if you talk about children or education, then he says, okay, there should, for instance, a certain stress should be there, because otherwise they're too weak. We just had with the antifragility, etc. And he talks about the moms. And this goes on and on. So it's or if you talk about political systems, where he comes, for instance, to Switzerland, or if he talks about foreign policy, where he says perhaps you should better accept small conflicts to avoid the great conflicts, or you should have better small fires in the forest to avoid the big fire. So if you avoid small fires for a long time, and then you have a huge fire, then the whole forest is burned. So, and there's a lot of this aspects he connects, which I find makes it interesting to read, or to also get an impression how he thinks.
Yeah, and I reflect on that in terms of our human tendency to desire order, and how that can set us up for these big crises, right? I mean, right now, of course, a lot of the economies in the world are hugely leveraged, massive amounts of debt. And there's an argument here that we should have allowed more controlled burns of economies across the world to reduce the debt levels, instead of continuing to bail ourselves out at various junctures and increase our debt levels. So, but we do that because as a species, we want to maintain order, like almost at any cost, rather than allowing ourselves to experience some discomfort and stress. And this stacks up problems for the future.
What I perhaps would like to add, because we also discussed this topic also in other podcasts or also in interviews, is that, for instance, he says, one aspect is also about antifragility, that less is often more. So if you talk about, for instance, risks, where, for instance, one party writes about where simple is more sophisticated, or the simpler the better. So it's not that complexity makes systems better or more antifragile. No, and that's also the aspect of virtue, or the other way around. What has a lot of compliance and a lot of rules make our financial system more antifragile? No, it hasn't. So and this is an interesting way. So this whole idea of less is more, I like a lot. And then his way of writing down those things also makes it fun to read it, because he is also very strong in his language. So, and also playing with this. And it takes just one example. And then, for instance, he takes an example about, and also about philosophy, etc. And then he says, for instance, inefficient is often very efficient. I mean, this is a very simple sentence, but there's an enormous amount of substance behind it. And then he takes examples of, and there's also something which you saw, for instance, in the corona crisis, or about value chains which all go over the world, that it can be very efficient to have certain parts in stock. If you take, for instance, microprocessors at the moment, a lot of companies can't produce cars, etc., because they don't have enough microprocessors or chips on stock. And he has a lot of examples from the Bible and from ancient times and philosophy and etc. And that makes it interesting. Or if he talks about this redundancy, he says, just realize that in our body we always have something extra. So we have two lungs, which I find excellent. So the idea is that we also could survive with one eye or one lung or whatsoever, but most of the stuff we have extra capacity. That when we lose something, or if we become sick or etc., when I lose one lung, I'm still able to survive. And I find this such a pure, simple and great example, because everybody immediately understands this. But if you are in a working environment, it's always about efficiency. But we also have seen this in the corona crisis. So we plan hospitals to be always fully using this capacity. And then something happens, and then we don't have enough beds on the intensive care. So you have this aspect of something which is a very actual situation. And then you read, for instance, about Singapore, and they have a whole hospital empty, that when they have a new virus, they can open it, and they have an enormous amount of IC, intensive care beds. But it's only built as a kind of extra capacity. And then you have exactly what he explains in the book.
Yeah. The other example of that I like is the Fukushima, which he cites in the book, right? That Fukushima was designed to withstand the highest earthquake they'd ever recorded in Japan. And this is another point he makes, right? The future is always new, right? It's always new. So this, again, it's an efficiency. So, well, we wouldn't want to make it to withstand anything stronger than we've ever had in the past. That wouldn't make sense, right? But of course, they paid the price, and so that efficiency became inefficient.
If you just mention Fukushima and the example that we only think about the past and not about the future, is a little bit this black swan topic. Do you want to explain the Great Turkey problem? Because that's also something I really, really like.
Well, no, go on. You're enthusiastic about it, please.
The Great Turkey problem is the idea that a turkey is really happy with its life, and he has a picture in the book, and he says, look at the picture. This turkey is get a lot of food and a brilliant life until it's one day before Thanksgiving. And that means that what you just said, that just looking into the past to have an idea what will happen in the future, it just doesn't make sense. And he has much more of these examples, also from a statistical point of view. He has another example I also like. It goes a little bit in the same direction. He says, if you want to have an impression of what's the average wage in Mexico, and you interview a lot of people, then for a long, long time, you have a very low income. Or at a certain point, you meet Carlos Slim, the richest person in Mexico, who owns, I don't know how much money. And then suddenly you have a totally different average. So I think this is a very valuable, let's say, lesson, also for entrepreneurs, but also for governments, etc. If you just talk about the corona crisis, we think too much in efficiency, and we don't think about extra space or think about the unknown or extra capacity or what's in the end effective. And that's something we really have forgotten. And then when something happens, also for instance in companies, liquidity. If you don't have enough liquidity, doesn't matter what happens, then you're gone. Although the main goal of your company is to survive any crisis. So, but if you just say, okay, what's the average amount of liquidity people have in the bank as a company? It's just not enough to survive any crisis, because our statistical way of thinking is wrong.
Right. And then he talks about anything to avoid the squeeze. He has this, and the squeeze is where we're forced into a position where we have to buy something at any cost. And I've been in periods like that in my life, and it's not a pleasant place to be. And that idea to be building up a surplus in order to, which may seem inefficient because we're not using that surplus for some other means, or in the same way as you say, within a factory building up a surplus of stock, or in a country building up surpluses of capacity. I mean, this is the other thing in terms of the global economy right now, is countries have specialized in different fields of manufacture and services and so on, which does set us up on a global level for periodic crises when we have a shock to the system, because individual nations haven't got the ability to be self-sufficient. So it's that's an interesting aspect here. The other thing I like that he talks about is that one of the problems with modern society is that we have these anti-fragile modern professions that benefit at the expense of everyone else. And of course, he uses the example of bankers. And he actually mentioned, I don't know if it was in this book, but in one of the books, where at a certain point he had to hire a bodyguard, and he bulked up physically because he felt like he was under threat for some of the things he was saying towards the banking system. But he makes this point that bankers in general, that they're anti-fragile, right? They tend to get bailed out. We see this, if they make poor decisions and the bank looks like it's in peril of bringing down the whole economy. But of course, they gain massively on the upside when they make good decisions. And so that they're anti-fragile, but who pays for that privilege? It's the rest of society. And I see a lot of murmurings right now in a similar direction towards the pharma companies in the current situation with the vaccines, that many of these companies don't have liability. So they're making huge profits on the upside of the vaccines, but they don't have legal liability if these vaccines cause problems down the line. So I think that's an important point that he makes there, and you can see why it's unpopular in certain segments of society.
It also has to do, let's say, that he's really willing to mention the people. So he really attacks people personally. And also in his language, he is pretty outspoken. So this part about the bankers is called on suckers and non-suckers. So he is, he's really, he's not a diplomatic guy, so to say. So which makes us in a way very funny to read, because he is really confronting. Really diving into the topic, so to say, but he does it in any field. So, for instance, just take another example about foreign policy. Then he really attacks the head editor of the New York Times, because he says, okay, he was very in favor of the war in, I don't know if it was Iraq or Iran, but he doesn't have skin in the game. So, and then he just attacks this guy and says, it's not, I don't know, he has not called it incorrect, but in much more stronger words, and say, okay, you really have to attack those people, because a lot of people died in the war, and this guy is one of the reasons that people thought we should fight there, and which is also an actual problem if you talk about Afghanistan. So the thing he says is, do you really think you can solve something or does it make more sense just not to go there and accept a certain internal tension in certain regions? And he also takes Pax Romana, and he takes the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, etc. So it's not that he just says something. He also takes examples from the past to prove for himself that he's right.
Yeah, and I think that's a recurring theme, right? This idea that the problem with human interventionism, this idea that we can bring order to these highly complex systems, and how often we do precisely the opposite, right? We actually cause more damage, and we would be much better off to allow these processes to play out, allow the system as a whole to burn off fragile elements, and gain in anti-fragility as a whole. And that would be a much, much better strategy in many of these situations.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And that's, again, I think we can relate that to coronavirus. I mean, I think it will be fascinating to see in the long run, those countries that have taken a much less interventionist approach versus those that are taking a super interventionist approach. What are the long-term outcomes for the health of their populations if you look at the sort of 5 to 10 year run? I mean, my bet is on those that have been less interventionist are going to come out of this better.
Yeah, for instance, just to quote him on this foreign policy, he says, "Time for American policymakers to understand that the more they intervene in other countries for the sake of stability, the more they bring instability." And it's a very good example also, but also the way he writes. So this kind of contradiction in sentences to say you intervene for stability, the more they bring instability. And that's I find it fascinating to read. But he really attacks. He says Saudi Arabia is the country at the present worries and offends me the most. So he's not talking in a very diplomatic way. No, he's really targeting on countries, on people, etc. It doesn't matter if it's Krugman or so. He takes all the people he really hates, and if you follow him on Twitter, it's incredible. It's this guy he doesn't really care at all.
Yeah, he's a New York bruiser with this extraordinary erudition that surpasses I guess virtually all academics and writing in these fields. He's an extraordinary individual. And that makes it. So whilst it is a long book, and as you say, there's a lot of words on each page, he's a very entertaining writer. Yeah.
Shall we dive into countries?
Countries. So Switzerland, Jay, do you want to talk about Switzerland? Come on.
I really have to say I haven't read the book before, and he is a big fan of Switzerland. So and that's for his theory of antifragility. I have to look it up. Where does he say this exactly? But he says, okay, Switzerland is the best to his opinion, and it has to do with in the end with checks and balances. So decentralized. So he's against centralization from a conceptual point of view. And then he's explaining why he likes this so much, and you have the aspect also of accepting this kind of decentralized outcomes. So if you have a lot of different entities, then you also have this kind of try and error, which he also likes. So he's somebody who started as a trader, and then afterwards, with his practical knowledge, still had, let's say, the energy and the willingness to do his PhD and become a professor, and then explain that it makes sense to understand how things work in practice. And then he said, for instance, he's a Nobel Prize winner, and he says we at the trading floor already 10 years before, we knew that that was a theory, but nobody of those traders wrote it down. So those people also didn't get the Nobel Prize for it, but let's say the Nobel Prize winner who got the prize for it is telling something which we knew before, and he's doing this in a lot of in a lot of fields, but he also does this in let's say on the organizational field of decentralized decision making, of the different layers. But even the idea of the Greek polis, where people got certain functions or certain jobs, so to say, just by chosen randomly, which is a very interesting thing to create a kind of participation. And there are also experiments done with this also at this time, for instance, in Luxembourg. And then they find out just by activating people randomly has excellent outcomes.
Right. And I suppose you could argue that that's because you're kind of creating a sense of volatility, right? Because you're creating a kind of randomness in the system, because you're not presumably when you've got these formal processes, you're getting a certain level of consistency in the individuals that end up in these positions, but you create the random effect. You effectively creating volatility, and as that's one of his axioms, is that volatility creates antifragility in complex systems. The other example that comes to mind, which I've cited before on the podcast, is I can't remember the name of the guy, but there's a Buddhist guy in New York who creates this cookie company, and their hiring policy is there's a list. You get added to the list, and when you come to the top of the list and there's a new position, you get hired. And that's a very successful cookie company. So a similar idea is this idea that formal processes that aim to deliver consistency give us the best outcomes is one that he challenges it.
Yeah, the funny thing is that I often take as an example, because we have this rotation system of primus inter pares, and I always say nobody knows the name of the president of Switzerland, for instance. He says exactly the same. They can usually name the presidents of France and the United States, but not their own. And he's talking about the Swiss, which is very funny. And then he says it's not quite true that the Swiss do not have a government, but they do not have a large central government. But they also have a rotation system. So this whole idea of a strong leader and a strong CEO, and Taleb lives in New York, so he is an American, or at least adapted to the US. He's from Lebanon, but and then he says no. This whole idea of putting one strong person as a president is the opposite is anti-fragile. So which let's say in this American context is especially for Americans must be much more strange or counterintuitive than it perhaps is for us or for me living in Switzerland, because I'm familiar with the idea that if you don't have a strong person, that the system is more stable, or as he would say, is more anti-fragile.
Yeah. And I suppose there's something about the again, this need for certainty and consistency in somewhere in the human soul, and it takes something to let go of that and trust the system.
It's also, we can also make a link to our first book podcast, because he also says small is beautiful in so many ways. Small is more anti-fragile than large. So, and the example he mentions in the books more often is restaurants. And he says, restaurants come and go by, but they're always restaurants. You can always eat somewhere. Or, and then he says, this will not disappear. This will not disappear. But the system as a whole reinvents itself all the time, and then a certain let's say time restaurants disappear because people are fond of a new way of cooking or another cuisine, but restaurants will always be there.
Yeah, that's right. And well, and I have a direct experience of big not being beautiful because I was in Arthur Andersen. I worked for Arthur Andersen, the very large accountancy firm, for those old enough to remember it. And who would have thought that would eventually go under pretty much overnight? Yeah, a massive global accounting firm just went pop based on one bad audit in America. I wasn't working there at the time. And yet again, I suppose that's another part of the human condition. There's this part of us, in all of us, that want to grow things big, right? We want to be involved in big things. We want to scale things, and I suppose that's an ego driven. But all of these, it's whether it's the desire for certainty and control and consistency. It's from the ego, whether it's a desire to scale, whether it's the desire to be the big man or the big woman in such a political system. These are all human drives that I guess he's pointing at here and challenging.
I also wanted to mention something which we also discussed in the past. Is he talks in a positive way about the European Union, which I like a lot. And he says, in my book, it's on page 90, it's away from extremistan. And he says, thankfully, the European Union is legally protected from over-centralization, thanks to the principle of subsidiarity. And that's also something, I was educated to work in the government, or I wanted to become a diplomat. And this whole idea of subsidiarity, which I know from the state system, where we also did a podcast about, that's something which I took into the companies. Because I said, okay, this idea of subsidiarity, you have to decide, let's say, in a city or in a neighborhood, and not discussing this in the parliament. So giving the power to where it makes sense to take the decision, that's something which I know from the state system. But then it comes, which I like a lot. He says, this idea was inherited from the Catholic Church. Also interesting. So this book has an enormous amount of dimensions, and also a lot of things which you perhaps wouldn't immediately expect. So you wouldn't expect, let's say, American author writing something very positive about the European Union, or connecting this with subsidiarity in the Catholic Church, etc. So it is a really broad way, or also intellectual way, of connecting all those different dots.
Yeah, but you can also see how the extent to which a drive towards consistency and order and centralization within the EU is creating its own fragility. I mean, look at the case of Britain, right? Mm-hmm. Arguably there wasn't enough of a commitment to subsidiarity in the case of Britain, and it was their drive for order and consistency which sort of forced the hand of the Brits.
Now, the question is, does it say more about the European Union, or does it more say about national politics in Britain? But that's perhaps a topic for another time, because but it's still. I just took the EU, but at the moment, a Dutch journalist wrote a book about comparing the Ottoman, the Austria-Hungary time, and compare this with the European Union, and say, okay, it won't be better. So just forget about this whole idea that it will be better. This is the best you can get. And that's exactly the same idea of this anti-fragility, which I like. I like a lot. And he says, for instance, the Ottomans, like the Romans before them, let local elites run the place so long as sufficient tax was paid. Pax Ottomana, and like the Pax Romana. But there's another aspect which I also talk a lot about. It's about Genoa and Venice. So I had to do a talk in Italy, a management talk, and I thought, okay, primus inter pares, how shall I explain this? That it makes sense to rotate and not putting this CEO on top, who is much more clever than all the other guys, and mostly guys. And I said, okay, let's take Venice. And then you see that, for instance, Venice, from 700 until 1700, 1,000 years, were a very rich city. So this whole Republican idea of of citizens in a city governing the city, but also rotating, is something very powerful. And he takes this. So, but he also takes Germany and Italy with a very decentralized structure. Those countries became national countries very late, 1870, much later than other countries, and that has also been their strength, because it's not one capital, it's not one part of the country which is strong. It's a lot of different regions with its own culture and its own certain focus on certain industries, etc. But he also takes this from the past, and I think Genoa and Venice are very good examples.
So, and what Genoa is another example of where they had a republic with a rotational leader, right? Yeah.
And you can still see on the paintings where, for instance, those elections are in Venice, etc. But you also have it in the Renaissance that doesn't matter what it is. If you go to Tuscany, etc., it's all the same. You have those merchants, and it's still elite, but it's not the king. It's not Louis XIV, and this typical French system and the huge palaces, etc. But it's the same in Amsterdam. So you have a very broad wealth, and you have a lot of merchants, and you have those houses on the canals, but you don't have. Netherlands is a monarchy at the moment, or since a longer time, but in the end, it's a republican structure which stabilizes the power in a society, and that's an example he also uses.
Yeah. Good. Well, we've been going for almost an hour now. Is there any final thoughts you don't think we've covered?
No, I really like the book, but it's really heavy stuff. So I would recommend people, if you like the topic, it's much easier to Google on YouTube, because it's also a delight to listen to him, and it's much easier than reading 500 pages. So I would say first, if you like it, Google and have a look. He did talks on Google, etc., etc.
Yeah, the Google Talks are very good.
Yeah, the Google Talk is an excellent example. And then after, if you want to dive into it much deeper, then I would take the book. Then after that, but if you start with the book, this is probably one of the most difficult books I read for this kind of podcast.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing I'd say is I actually think it's the best of his books, or certainly in terms of has provided the most value in my life. That's the other thing I'd say. So if you're going to start anywhere with Taleb, then definitely this one, Antifragile, would be my recommendation. But
do you have, for instance, because you immediately react on the Google Talk, do you have another example, for instance? Because I think that his talks, which are on YouTube, are excellent. And the funny thing is, what I like a lot is that he really interacts with his audience. So it's not that he always talks exactly the same. No, he goes to Google and then he starts asking them questions.
Yeah.
And that makes it even more interesting to listen to.
Yeah. No, I don't have another specific talk in mind. That's the one that stands out. It's been a while since I've watched any of his talks, but that's just the one that sticks out as being a good one. Yeah. All righty. Well,
great.
Thanks again. Another book nailed. Antifragile. This has been a delight. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Richard.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Read This with me, Richard Atherton, and my fantastic co-host, Tom van der Lubbe. If any of the material in this show resonated with you, if you're thinking, perhaps, how could I take these ideas and apply them in my own leadership or take them forward into my own organization, then I would love to have a conversation with you about that. If that feels like that could be a valuable use of your time, then please do click on the Calendly link in the description for this episode, and that will allow you to book a slot directly into my calendar. And I hope to speak to you soon.